first, we're going to read the section about William Shakespeare. So let's have a look inside. And you can see the contents on this side. The writer's life, immortal bard, reader's guide, selected tragedies, the writer at work, a universe of feeling and sources and inspiration, the Elizabethan theatre. So I'm going to start on this side. And we have an illustration of William Shakespeare, 1564 to 1616, says, "The greatest and most famous of English writers, Shakespeare reigned supreme in the theatre at a particularly fertile period of English drama. His career as actor, playwright, took him from Stratford to London, where he wrote his celebrated tragedies in the first decade of the 16th century. Unmatched in his gift for language, he created legendary characters and dramatic moments, which have inspired audiences and artists down to the present day." Now, I really do like these magazines, even though they're quite old now, because they've got some great illustrations, and as you know, I do like a good illustrated magazine or book. So I'm going to actually turn this page over, so it's just a bit easier to read. Immortal bard. Shakespeare's dazzling theatrical career was based in London, but he regarded Stratford as his true home, his fellow playwright Ben Jonson dubbing him Sweet Swan of Avon. And here is a map of Warwickshire, called the Heart of England, where Shakespeare grew up. It's noted for its beauty and historical richness, a fertile background for his work. Let me show you a bit closer. There we go. And then down here we have Shakespeare's, the house that Shakespeare was born in, or said to have been born in Stratford's Henley Street. When his father died in 1601, Shakespeare inherited the property. So let's begin reading. Unlike his plays, William Shakespeare's career was singularly undramatic, for he lived the life of a cautiously successful middle-class businessman. As his business and personal life. In 1556, he bought 2 houses in Henley Street, and the following year he married Mary Arden, who was of a rather higher social class. John Shakespeare came to own a considerable amount of property in Stratford and was one of the town's most respected citizens, holding a succession of public offices, including that of bailiff or mayor. Stratford at this time was, in the words of the contemporary antiquarian William Camden, a handsome small market town. Its population was about 1,500 when William Shakespeare was born. But in that very year the plague struck and 237 burials were recorded. From July to December, roughly 1 in 6 of the inhabitants died. Baby William was no doubt fortunate to survive his plague-ridden first year, but nothing is documented of this or the rest of his childhood. However, as the eldest son of one of the town's leading citizens, he would have received the best education available locally, and it is likely that he attended Stratford Grammar School. Shakespeare probably started at the school aged 7 or 8, and would have been thoroughly steeped in Latin, doing little else for about 8 hours a day, 6 days a week. It was probably during his school days that he first became stage-struck. Stratford had no theatre, but travelling players often performed there, and Shakespeare's father, as bailiff, had the duty of licensing them. It was no doubt in the Guildhall, immediately below his schoolroom, that young William saw his first plays. Pupils usually attended the grammar school until they were about 15, but Shakespeare may have left earlier in order to help his father, who had run into financial difficulties. The next firm date we have in Shakespeare's life, however, is 1582, when, at the age of 18, he married Anne Hathaway, who was 8 years his senior and 3 months pregnant. She came from a landowning family at a nearby village, but nothing is known about her personally. The ceremony took place in November, and a daughter, Susanna, was born in May 1583. 2 more children, the twins, Hamnet and Judith, followed in 1585. Because the marriage was evidently made in haste, and because Shakespeare spent much of his later life away from his family in London, it has been surmised that the union was an unhappy one. However, there is no real evidence for this, and Shakespeare certainly regarded Stratford as his permanent home. Okay, so before we carry on, let's have a look at the pictures. So here is Anne Hathaway's cottage. Shakespeare's wife came from Shottery, just outside Stratford. Although known as Anne Hathaway's cottage, this house was her father's. Let me show you a bit closer. And here we have Elizabeth I, who was an enthusiastic patron of the theatre. She had her own troupe of actors, the Queen's Men, and Shakespeare's company often performed for her. And if I just open this out, we can see this picture here. Says Shakespeare probably began his education at Petty or elementary school, then spent about 5 or 6 years at Stratford Grammar School above, where he mastered Latin. And then we've got some key mentioned as a dramatist in London. Circa 1595, he wrote Romeo and Juliet. 1596, the death of his son Hamnet. 1597, he buys New Place, Stratford. Circa 1600, he wrote Hamlet. 1601, death of his father. Circa 1605, he wrote King Lear. His mother died in 1608. Circa 1610, he retires to Stratford. 1616, dies in Stratford. And 1623, publication of his first folio, the earliest collected edition of his work. So let's carry on. Between the birth of his twins in 1585 and the first mention of him as a playwright in London in 1592, there is no documentary evidence as to what Shakespeare was doing, and consequently this period has been called the missing years. Predictably, there has been no shortage of theories to fill the gap, and because Shakespeare's work covers such a vast range of human experiences, it has been suggested he was a soldier, a sailor, a lawyer, and many other things. The 17th century antiquary John Aubrey, however, wrote on good authority that Shakespeare had been in his younger years a schoolmaster in the country. Two of the most popular legends about Shakespeare refer to the missing years. The first tells how he is supposed to have poached deer from the estate of Sir Thomas Lucy at Charlecote, near Stratford, was whipped, wrote an abusive ballad in revenge, and fled home to escape Sir Thomas's wrath. The second tells how Shakespeare gained his entry to the theatrical profession by looking after the horses of rich theatre goers whilst they watched the performance. In 1594, Shakespeare joined a new company, the Lord Chamberlain's Men, which soon became the leading theatrical group in London. It not only had the best writer, but also the best actors, its stars being Richard Burbage, as renowned in his own day as David Garrick or John Gielgud were to later ages, and Will Kemp, famous as a low comedian and dancer. In 1600 Morris danced from London to Norwich for a bet. The Chamberlain's Men made their first appearance at court at Christmas of 1594, and payment was made jointly to Burbage, Kemp and Shakespeare, an indication of their prominence in the company. Shakespeare remained with the Chamberlain's Men, renamed the King's Men after the accession of James I in 1603. For the rest of his career, he was the only major writer of the time to have a permanent, prominent position with a team of first-class actors, and he often wrote parts with particular members of the company in mind. His own acting skills were valued by his colleagues. Among the parts he is said to have played is the ghost in Hamlet, but as he became busier as a writer and manager, he had less time for acting, and his last recorded performance was in a production of Ben Jonson's Sejanus in 1603. Let's have a look at the pictures. So, down here and on this picture. Okay, I thought that went over the page, but it doesn't. Okay. By 1597, Shakespeare was affluent enough to buy New Place, below here, the second largest house in Stratford, standing in about an acre of ground. It had 2 barns and 2 orchards. The property was demolished in the 18th century, and a garden on the right here now occupies the site of the house. Let me show you. Okay. By this time, Shakespeare, now approaching 40, had achieved great professional and financial success. In 1597, a year after the death of his son Hamnet, he bought New Place, one of the finest houses in Stratford, and in 1602, a year after the death of his father, he bought 127 acres of land there. The clearest indication of the reputation he enjoyed in the theatrical world is a passage in a literary handbook called Pallades Damia, Wit's Treasury by Francis Mears, published in 1598, as Plautus and Seneca are as accounted the best of comedy and tragedy among the Latines, so Shakespeare among the English is the most excellent in both kinds for this stage. Early retirement. In about 1610, Shakespeare left London and settled at his house in Stratford, where he lived the life of a retired gentleman. No one knows why Shakespeare decided to leave the stage when he was still only in his mid-40s, but it has been suggested that he suffered a severe illness. His first biographer, Nicholas Rowe, in his Life of 1709, wrote that Shakespeare for this